How France still controls and prints money for 14 African countries and keeps the change. The date is December 19th, 1960. The city is Dakar, capital of the newly independent Republic of Senegal. The cameras are rolling. The crowds are cheering in the streets, waving flags striped green, yellow, and red. President Leopold Sédar Senghor stands on a platform draped in new colors, his hand pressed to his heart as the national anthem plays for the first time. The Colonial governor boards a plane back to Paris. The newspapers declare it a triumph. We are told this is freedom. We are told this is independence. We are told the colonial era has ended. But if you look closely at the banknote in the hand of a street vendor selling mangoes that same afternoon, you will see something strange. The currency says Franc. It bears the guarantee of the French Treasury. It is printed not in Dakar, not in any African city, but in Chamalières, a small town in central France. The ink is French. The paper is French. The control is French. This is not independence. This is a magic trick. The flag changed, but the vault did not. We think colonialism ended because we saw the ceremonies and heard the speeches. We think sovereignty was granted because new nations joined the United Nations and sent ambassadors to foreign capitals. But sovereignty is not a speech. Sovereignty is not a flag. Sovereignty is solvency. They were granted the appearance of freedom while the balance sheet remained locked in a filing cabinet in Paris. This is the story of the CFA franc. It is the story of how 180 million people in Africa today live under a monetary system designed not for their prosperity, but for the convenience of a former colonial power. It is a financial architecture built in 1945 that has survived wars, coups, protests, and presidents. It is the ghost that never left. It is the tax that never ended. And it is one of the most successful con jobs in modern economic history. To understand how deep this system runs, you need to go back to 1945. The war in Europe has just ended. France is on its knees. The factories are rubble. The railways are bombed. The treasury is empty. Millions are dead. The nation that once styled itself the arbiter of European civilization is now dependent on American loans and British goodwill. Charles de Gaulle, the self-appointed savior of French pride, is desperate to restore the country's power. But he faces a problem. France is broke, bankrupt in all but name. De Gaulle understands something crucial. France cannot compete with the industrial might of the United States or the ideological zeal of the Soviet Union. But France has something neither superpower possesses: Africa. Vast territories rich in cocoa, gold, uranium, oil, and timber. Millions of laborers. Captive markets for French goods. If France loses Africa, it loses its claim to global relevance. It becomes just another mid-sized European nation, a footnote in the New World Order. But independence movements are rising across the continent. The moral argument for empire is collapsing. The United Nations is pressuring colonial powers to grant self-determination. De Gaulle knows he cannot hold Africa by force alone, so he devises a different strategy. Grant political independence, but lock in economic dependence. Let them have their flags and anthems. Let them have their presidents and parliaments. But never, ever let them control their own money. In 1945, the French Treasury creates the CFA franc. The acronym stands for Colonies Françaises d'Afrique, French colonies of Africa. Later, after independence becomes inevitable, The name is changed to Communauté Financière Africaine and Coopération Financière en Afrique Centrale. The words are soft, the PR is updated, but the system itself remains unchanged. It is colonialism with a rebranding campaign. The CFA franc is pegged to the French franc at a fixed exchange rate. This sounds technical, boring even, but it is the key to everything. A pegged currency means African nations cannot devalue or revalue their money to suit their own economic needs. They cannot adjust for inflation or unemployment. They cannot respond to commodity price shocks. Their monetary policy is set not in Abidjan or Libreville, but in Paris. And later, when the euro replaces the franc, it is set in Frankfurt by the European Central Bank. 14 African nations have no seat at that table. No vote, no voice. But the real mechanism of control lies deeper. Member states are required to deposit a percentage of their foreign exchange reserves into the French Treasury. For decades, this figure hovered around 50%. Imagine that. Imagine earning money from exports, from the sweat of your farmers and miners, and being forced to send half of it to a foreign government for safekeeping. France invests those reserves. France earns interest on them. France uses them to stabilize its own economy. Meanwhile, African nations are told they must ask permission to access their own money. This is not a partnership. This is a hostage situation. The reserves sit in accounts at the Banque de France, generating returns that flow to Paris, not to the capitals of West or Central Africa. It is a system where the poor lend to the rich, where the colonized continue to finance the colonizer decades after the flags came down. Think about the scale of that. Billions of dollars year after year flowing from some of the poorest countries on earth into the treasury of one of the richest. It is not foreign aid in reverse. It is structural extraction. It is the same logic that powered the slave trade and the rubber plantations, dressed up in the language of monetary cooperation. The third pillar of the system is the freedom of capital movement. French companies operating in CFA countries can repatriate their profits without restriction. They can pull money out as easily as water flows downhill. But African entrepreneurs face barriers and controls. Wealth generated in Africa does not stay in Africa. It flows to shareholders in Lyon and Marseille. It builds suburbs in Paris. It funds pensions for French retirees. The extraction never stopped. It just went digital. And then there is the matter of governance. For decades, the central banks of the CFA zones included French officials in key decision-making roles. The Banque Centrale des États de l'Afrique de l'Ouest and the Banque des États de l'Afrique Centrale were not fully sovereign institutions. They operated under frameworks designed in Paris, with French technicians and advisors embedded at every level. The illusion of independence was maintained, but the gears of power turned in a familiar direction. Supporters of the CFA system will tell you it provides stability. They will point to low inflation rates compared to countries like Zimbabwe or Nigeria. They will argue that the peg to the euro shields member states from currency volatility and runaway money printing. And on paper, this is true. The CFA franc has not collapsed into hyperinflation. Prices have remained relatively stable. But stability is not the same as prosperity. A prisoner in a cell is stable. A man in a coma is stable. Stability without growth, without industrialization, without the ability to chart your own economic course, is just stagnation with a French accent. The CFA countries have some of the lowest rates of industrial development in Africa. They import more than they export in manufactured goods. Their economies remain dependent on raw materials, just as they were in the colonial era. The currency peg keeps the franc strong relative to local purchasing power. This makes imports cheap and exports expensive. French goods flood African markets. African products struggle to compete internationally. The cobbler in Benin cannot compete with shoes made in China and priced in euros. The textile factory in Togo closes because it is cheaper to import fabric from Europe. The monetary policy designed in Paris is not designed for African industrialization. It is designed to maintain French economic influence. History is littered with the bodies of leaders who dared to challenge this system. In 1963, Sylvanus Olympio, the first president of Togo, announced his intention to leave the CFA zone and create an independent Togolese currency. He wanted control over his nation's monetary policy. He wanted to print money that bore the face of Togolese heroes, not French bureaucrats. 3 days after he refused to sign a cooperation agreement with France, he was assassinated, shot dead outside the American embassy in Lome by soldiers who had been denied payment by the French military. His blood soaked into the pavement. His dream of monetary sovereignty died with him. In 1962, Modibo Keïta of Mali withdrew from the CFA franc zone and introduced the Malian franc. He believed his nation could chart an independent course, could build socialism without French interference, but France retaliated swiftly. Credit was cut off. Trade relationships were frozen. Mali's economy was strangled. By 1967, Keïta was facing popular unrest and economic collapse. In 1968, he was overthrown in a coup. Mali eventually rejoined the CFA zone. The lesson was clear. Defiance has a price, and France is willing to collect. Then came 1994, the year of the Great Devaluation. For decades, the CFA franc had been pegged to the French franc at a rate that increasingly diverged from economic reality. African exports were becoming uncompetitive. Debt was mounting. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, with France's blessing, pushed for a massive devaluation to restore balance. On January 12, 1994, the CFA franc was devalued by 50% overnight. 50%. Let that number sink in. Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that your savings are worth half of what they were the night before. Imagine the price of bread doubling. Imagine imported medicine, school fees, rent, all suddenly twice as expensive. This was not a gradual adjustment. This was economic shock therapy. Millions of people across 14 nations watched their purchasing power evaporate. The middle class was gutted. The poor were pushed into destitution. And the decision was made not by African governments, but by technocrats in Washington and Paris. The devaluation was sold as a necessary reform, a painful but essential step to restore competitiveness. But for ordinary people, it was a betrayal. It revealed the lie at the heart of the CFA system. When it mattered most, when the ledger needed balancing, African nations had no say. The power to destroy their savings, to reshape their economies, to impose suffering on their citizens, rested in foreign hands. Sovereignty is solvency, and in 1994, the insolvency was laid bare for all to see. Yet the system endured. Despite protests, despite the anger, despite the calls for reform, the CFA franc survived. France made minor adjustments over the years. The reserve deposit requirement was reduced. The rhetoric was softened, but the fundamental architecture remained. The currency is still pegged to the euro. The printing presses are still in France. The financial ties are still binding. In 2019, under pressure from a new generation of African activists and economists, France announced reforms. President Emmanuel Macron stood beside the presidents of CFA nations and declared that the franc would be renamed, that French representatives would leave the central bank boards, that the reserve requirements would be eliminated. It was presented as the end of an era, the final decolonization of the monetary system, but critics were skeptical. The currency would still be pegged to the euro. The ultimate backstop would still be the French Treasury. The reforms were cosmetic. The chains were polished, but not removed. Today, 14 countries remain in the CFA zone. Benin, Burkina Faso, Ivory Coast, Guinea-Bissau, Mali, Niger, Senegal, and Togo use the West African CFA franc. Cameroon, Central African Republic, Chad, Republic of Congo, Equatorial Guinea, and Gabon use the Central African CFA franc. Together, they represent 180 million people. 180 million lives shaped by a currency they do not control, by a monetary policy they do not set, by a financial system designed in the rubble of post-war Europe. The consequences are visible everywhere. These nations are rich in resources but poor in capital. They export cocoa and uranium and oil, but they import finished goods and machinery. The value is added elsewhere. The profits are taken elsewhere. The wealth is generated in African soil and African labor, but it accumulates in foreign accounts. This is not an accident. This is not a failure of governance or a quirk of geography. This is the system working as designed. Designed. Consider Niger, one of the world's largest uranium producers. French nuclear power plants run on uranium mined in the deserts of Niger by companies with deep ties to the French state. Yet Niger is one of the poorest countries on earth. Life expectancy is low, literacy rates are low, infrastructure is crumbling. The uranium leaves, the wealth leaves. What remains is dust and dependency. Consider Ivory Coast, the world's largest cocoa producer. The chocolate that fills the shelves of European supermarkets begins in Ivorian fields, harvested by farmers who earn less than $2 a day. The cocoa is shipped to France and Switzerland, where it is processed, branded, and sold at 100 times the price paid to the farmer. The CFA franc ensures that Ivorian cocoa remains cheap for European buyers and that profits flow north. The farmers stay poor. The corporations stay rich. This is the genius of the system. It does not require soldiers or governors or colonial administrators. It requires only a currency, a central bank, and a fixed exchange rate. It requires only the silent, invisible hand of financial control. The World Bank calls it monetary stability. African activists call it neo-colonialism. Both are correct. The defenders of the CFA will tell you that it prevents the chaos seen in countries with independent currencies. They will point to the hyperinflation in Zimbabwe, the currency collapses in Ghana in the 1980s, the instability in Nigeria. They will say that African governments cannot be trusted with their own printing presses, that they would squander their sovereignty through corruption and mismanagement. This argument is paternalism dressed as pragmatism. It assumes that poverty and dependence are preferable to risk and autonomy. But there is another story, one that is rarely told. The story of Botswana, which refused to join any monetary union and built one of Africa's most stable economies. The story of Rwanda, which pursues independent monetary policy and has achieved remarkable growth. The story of Ghana, which stumbled but learned and now manages its own currency with increasing competence. These nations are not perfect. They face challenges, but they face them as sovereign entities with the power to adjust, to experiment, to fail, and to succeed on their own terms. Sovereignty is not a guarantee of prosperity, but the absence of sovereignty is a guarantee of dependency. The CFA franc is a chain that no amount of goodwill or reform can fully disguise. It is a reminder that colonialism did not end with independence. It evolved, it adapted. It learned to speak the language of partnership while maintaining the structure of domination. The generational cost of this system is incalculable. Imagine the businesses that were never started because capital was locked away in Paris. Imagine the schools that were never built because reserves were frozen in foreign accounts. Imagine the factories that were never opened because the exchange rate made imports cheaper than domestic production. Imagine the engineers, the inventors, the entrepreneurs who left for Europe or America because their own economies offered no opportunity. This is the silent theft. This is the compounding loss. And it continues. Today, in 2026, the CFA franc is still in use. The debates rage on in universities, in parliaments, in the streets. Young Africans, connected by the internet, educated in economics, are asking the questions their grandparents were not allowed to ask. Why do we use a currency we do not control? Why do our reserves sit in Paris? Why are we poor in a land so rich? The answers are in the ledger. They are in the treaties signed in the flush of independence, when African leaders, desperate for recognition and support, accepted terms they did not fully understand. They are in the structural adjustment programs of the 1980s and 90s, when debt crises gave France and the IMF leverage to tighten the system further. They are in the coups and assassinations that silenced dissent. They are in the banking codes and central bank statutes written in French legal jargon and imposed as conditions for membership in the global financial system. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is documented history. The mechanisms are public. The treaties are accessible. The reserve deposits are acknowledged by the French government. The currency peg is official policy. The only conspiracy is the silence. The fact that most of the world does not know. The fact that this arrangement persists in plain sight, unchallenged by the international community, unreported by major media.